The moonlit alley was silent, save for the sound of hurried footsteps echoing against the brick walls. 34-year-old Angela Carter, a nurse on her way home from a long shift, clutched her bag tightly. As she turned a corner, a figure darted out from the shadows, a man wearing a ski mask, brandishing a knife, demanding her belongings. Angela's heartbeat quickened, but her mind sharpened. Fear didn't paralyze her. Instead, it fueled her resolve. Without hesitation, she took a step back, quickly assessing her surroundings. Spotting a piece of wooden debris nearby, she grabbed it, mustering every ounce of her strength to defend herself. In a swift, decisive motion, she struck the man's arm, causing him to drop the knife. Her attacker stumbled, giving Angela just enough time to pin him against a wall and call for help. The sound of sirens pierced the tension-filled air moments later. When the police arrived, they found Angela holding the subdued robber, her expression a mix of relief and determination. News of her bravery spread quickly, painting her as a local hero, a woman who refused to be victimized and took justice into her own hands. But Angela's journey was far from over. The courtroom became her new battlefield. What she didn't anticipate was how her identity as a Black woman would complicate what seemed like a straightforward case. As her testimony unfolded, murmurs of skepticism rippled through the audience. Questions that had little to do with the facts of the case were raised. Why didn't she wait for the police? Was her response excessive? Angela, once celebrated as a hero, now found herself under scrutiny. But she was no stranger to the complexities of systemic bias. As the daughter of civil rights activists, she understood the unspoken rules that govern perceptions of race and gender. Her parents had often warned her about the double standards she would face, but experiencing them firsthand was another matter entirely. Her case wasn't just about her actions that night. It became a reflection of a larger societal issue. The stark disparity in how justice was applied, based on race and gender, loomed large. Would a white woman in Angela's position face the same level of doubt? Would the judge evaluate her actions through the same lens? The stakes grew higher when Angela learned more about the judge presiding over her case. Judge Harrison Whitman, known for his strict adherence to the law, had a history of rulings that some saw as biased. His decisions often sparked debates about whether justice was truly blind. For Angela, this added another layer of uncertainty to an already daunting situation. As Angela prepared to face the courtroom, the question hanging over her was not just about the robber's guilt. It was whether her own courage and quick thinking would be validated or vilified. Would she be seen as a woman who stood up against injustice, or would the biases entrenched in the system cast her as a villain? The anticipation was palpable. Angela's story had captured national attention, and the outcome of her case promised to spark conversations far beyond the courtroom walls. This is the story of Angela Carter, a woman who dared to confront danger head-on and the legal system that would test her resolve. It's a story of courage, bias, and a decision that would shock everyone watching. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation on the first day of the trial. Angela Carter sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded tightly, trying to steady herself as the prosecutor outlined her actions that night. Despite the heroism that had been lauded in the immediate aftermath of the incident, the atmosphere in the courtroom was far less forgiving. The defense attorney wasted no time sowing doubt. Was it necessary for Ms. Carter to use force? He asked, emphasizing the size difference between Angela and the robber. Couldn't she have just surrendered her belongings and avoided escalating the situation? Angela's stomach tightened as these questions were raised. Her bravery, once celebrated, was now being dissected as if it were a character flaw. The prosecutor countered, highlighting Angela's quick thinking and courage, but the seeds of doubt had been planted. Meanwhile, the media latched onto the narrative with sensational headlines. Hero or vigilante? Nurses' actions questioned in court. Social media became a battleground of opinions, with strangers debating her actions as if they were sitting on the jury. Some defended Angela, praising her as an inspiration for standing up to crime. Others echoed the defense's argument, questioning her judgment and whether her actions were reckless. The weight of these judgments pressed down on Angela. She found herself reliving that night in the alley, second-guessing her decisions. Did I do the right thing? She asked her lawyer one evening. I just wanted to protect myself, but the scrutiny extended beyond her individual actions. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Angela's identity as a black woman was shaping perceptions of the case. Witnesses who came forward to vouch for her character were met with skepticism, while the defense subtly implied that her assertiveness might be perceived as aggression. Judge Harrison Whitman, sitting atop his bench, remained stoic throughout the proceedings. His reputation as a by-the-book judge made every moment in the courtroom feel like walking a tightrope. Angela couldn't shake the feeling that she was being held to a higher standard than the man who had attempted to rob her. Outside the courtroom, Angela faced another battle: public opinion. Her face became a symbol in debates about race, gender, and justice. Friends and strangers alike reached out to share their support, but she also received hate mail and threats. "You should have let the police handle it," one anonymous letter read. "Who do you think you are?" These challenges began to take a toll on Angela's mental and emotional well-being. Nights were sleepless, her mind racing with fears of what the verdict might mean, not just for her, but for others who might find themselves in similar situations. Her family tried to offer comfort, but even they were struggling to make sense of the ordeal. The trial reached a pivotal moment when the defense called the robber, Marcus Tate, to testify. Marcus appeared remorseful, his voice trembling as he recounted the night of the robbery. "I was desperate," he said. "I lost my job, my family, everything. I wasn't thinking straight." The prosecutor pressed him on his actions. "You approached Miss Carter with a knife. Do you acknowledge that?" "Yes," Marcus admitted, "but I didn't want to hurt her. I just wanted the money." Angela watched the jury closely, trying to read their expressions. Would they see Marcus as a desperate man who made a mistake, or as someone who had intentionally endangered her life? The defense shifted the narrative, painting Marcus as a victim of circumstance and Angela as someone who had overreacted. They emphasized that the knife wasn't used and that Marcus had no history of violent crimes. It was a subtle but effective strategy, shifting the focus away from the crime and toward Angela's response. Angela's lawyer fought back, presenting evidence of the knife, police reports, and eyewitness accounts that corroborated her version of events. But the burden of proof seemed heavier for Angela than it did for Marcus. As the trial dragged on, Angela couldn't help but feel the systemic inequities at play. If the roles had been reversed, if she had been the attacker and Marcus the victim, would the defense work so hard to humanize her? Would the judge be as measured in his demeanor, or would her guilt have been assumed from the start? In one particularly tense moment, Angela took the stand to recount her experience. The prosecutor guided her through the events of that night, allowing her to share her fear, her desperation, and her relief when the police arrived. But under cross-examination, the defense attorney's tone grew sharper. "Ms. Carter, you've said you were scared for your life, but you chose to fight back instead of running or surrendering. Isn't it true that you escalated the situation?" Angela took a deep breath, holding back tears. "I didn't have time to think about running," she replied. "I did what I had to do to survive." Her response hung in the air, raw and unfiltered. But whether it resonated with the jury or reinforced the defense's narrative remained to be seen. The case was no longer just about Angela and Marcus. It had become a microcosm of a much larger issue: how the legal system, shaped by centuries of racial and gender bias, often placed the burden of proof disproportionately on those who dared to defend themselves. As the trial neared its conclusion, Angela braced herself for what lay ahead. She had done everything in her power to stand up for what was right. But in a system that often conflated justice with judgment, would her truth be enough? The investigation into the robbery began with what seemed to be an open and shut case. Police reports confirmed Angela Carter's account. Marcus Tate had approached her with a knife, demanded her belongings, and was subdued by Angela after she acted in self-defense. Yet as the details unfolded, the biases inherent in the system began to rear their head. Detectives initially commended Angela for her bravery, but whispers of doubt crept into the narrative as soon as Marcus began to speak. He described himself as a desperate man who had hit rock bottom, not a hardened criminal. "I didn't mean to scare her," he repeated during questioning. "I was just trying to survive." The knife he used was found to be an old, slightly rusted pocket blade, not the menacing weapon some might imagine. This detail, though minor, began to shift perspectives. Suddenly, Angela's swift and decisive actions were cast in a different light. She could have handled it differently, one investigator muttered, unaware that Angela overheard. The comment stung not because it questioned her actions, but because it reflected a deeper issue. The unspoken expectation that Angela, as a black woman, should have responded with restraint, even in the face of imminent danger. Critical evidence, such as the surveillance footage from a nearby store, should have bolstered Angela's case. The grainy video clearly showed Marcus brandishing the knife and Angela defending herself. However, even this was met with skepticism. It's hard to tell if he was truly threatening her, Marcus's defense attorney argued. He doesn't appear to lunge or make any aggressive movements. The prosecutor countered, pointing out the context and the fear Angela must have felt in that moment. Yet the narrative was already tilting. A subtle but significant shift that placed Angela's actions under the microscope while softening the perception of Marcus's intent. As these debates unfolded in court, Angela's frustration grew. She felt like she was on trial, not Marcus. "Why do I have to justify protecting myself?" she confided to her lawyer one evening. Outside the courtroom, Angela's case began to attract the attention of activists and advocacy groups. The Women's Defense Coalition reached out to offer their support, highlighting Angela's case as an example of the double standards faced by women, particularly women of color, in the justice system. She acted in self-defense, one of their representatives said during a press conference, and yet, she's being forced to defend her humanity. This is not just about Angela. It's about every woman who has ever been told she was too emotional, too aggressive, or too imperfect to deserve justice. Angela also found an ally in Reverend Charles Daniels, a community leader who had long fought for racial equity in the legal system. Reverend Daniels organized rallies outside the courthouse, where supporters held signs reading, "Justice for Angela. Self-defense is not a crime. End the bias." These displays of solidarity gave Angela strength, but they also attracted backlash. Opponents criticized the rallies as pressure tactics, accusing her supporters of trying to sway the court. The media frenzy intensified. Some outlets ran stories focusing on Angela's bravery, while others speculated about her true intentions. The public was divided, and Angela felt the weight of every opinion, every headline. As the trial continued, Angela's emotional resilience was tested. She was forced to recount the incident repeatedly, reliving the fear and adrenaline of that night. Each retelling felt like an emotional wound being reopened. The defense attempted to discredit her further, questioning her motives and suggesting she had acted out of anger rather than fear. "You were tired after a long shift," the defense attorney said during cross-examination. "Isn't it possible that your judgment was clouded?" "No," Angela replied firmly. "I knew exactly what I was doing. I was trying to save my life." Her lawyer, sensing the need to shift the narrative, brought in an expert witness, a psychologist specializing in trauma and self-defense. The expert explained how adrenaline and fear can heighten a person's instincts, leading to split-second decisions that are often the difference between life and death. This wasn't about anger, the expert testified. It was about survival. The testimony helped, but it wasn't enough to erase the doubts that had been planted. A breakthrough came when Angela's lawyer unearthed Marcus's prior criminal record. Minor offenses, but enough to paint a clearer picture of his intentions that night. While the defense tried to downplay the significance, the revelation strengthened Angela's case, showing that Marcus's actions weren't entirely out of character. Additionally, a new piece of evidence emerged. An audio recording from a bystander who had been too afraid to intervene, but had captured the altercation on their phone. In the recording, Marcus could be heard threatening Angela, "Give me the bag, or I'll make you regret it." This evidence was a turning point. It was harder to argue that Marcus hadn't posed a real threat. The tides began to shift, albeit slowly. The prosecutor used the recording to emphasize Angela's bravery and the real danger she had faced. Meanwhile, Angela's supporters ramped up their efforts, sharing the audio widely to counteract the negative media narrative. Even with these developments, the trial raised deeper questions about justice. Why did it take so much effort to validate Angela's fear? Why was her character scrutinized more harshly than Marcus's actions? Angela's lawyer summarized the issue during closing arguments. This case is about more than one woman's actions on one night. It's about whether we believe in the right to defend oneself, regardless of race or gender. It's about fairness in a system that too often demands perfection from those it should protect. As the jury deliberated, Angela felt a mixture of hope and exhaustion. She had fought harder than she ever imagined, not just against a robber, but against a system that seemed intent on questioning her worth. Would justice prevail? Or would the biases she had faced all her life win out once again? The courtroom was silent as Judge Harrison Whitman prepared to deliver his verdict. Angela Carter sat stiffly in her chair, her pulse echoing in her ears. The jury had deliberated for hours, but to Angela, it had felt like days. Judge Whitman, his face unreadable, adjusted his glasses and began. This case has raised important questions about self-defense, proportionality, and how our justice system navigates issues of race and gender. These matters weigh heavily on the court, but my decision must be guided by the law. The room held its collective breath. The court finds the defendant, Marcus Tate, guilty of attempted robbery. A wave of relief washed over Angela. She felt her shoulders sag, the tension momentarily lifting. But the judge wasn't finished. In regard to the plaintiff, Ms. Carter, and the issue of her actions that night, he paused, his gaze scanning the room. The court concludes that while her actions were extraordinary, they were justified under the circumstances. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Angela's lawyer squeezed her hand, whispering, "You did it." But then Judge Whitman added a caveat that no one had expected. However, this case exposes systemic issues in how such incidents are handled. The burden placed on individuals like Ms. Carter to defend themselves and then justify those actions in court is deeply troubling. The court recommends a review of self-defense laws to ensure they are applied equitably. The verdict was met with mixed reactions. Angela, though relieved, couldn't ignore the judge's pointed remarks. While she had been exonerated, the trial had left her emotionally drained. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Angela for comments. She managed a few words. "I'm grateful for the support I've received, but this journey has shown me how much work remains to be done. This isn't just about me. It's about justice for everyone." Marcus Tate's sentencing brought little closure. He was given 5 years in prison with the possibility of parole, a sentence that sparked heated debates. Some argued it was too lenient, given the fear he had caused Angela. Others viewed it as excessive for a man they deemed desperate and struggling. The judge's recommendation for legislative review ignited a firestorm. Legal experts dissected his statement, with some applauding his courage and others criticizing him for overstepping his role. Activists seized on the moment, using Angela's case as a rallying cry for broader reform. The case quickly became a flashpoint in discussions about race, gender, and justice. Advocacy groups highlighted Angela's ordeal as emblematic of a system that disproportionately scrutinizes women of color. Panel discussions on news outlets debated the implications of the verdict. This case isn't just about self-defense, one legal analyst argued. It's about how society views Black women, how their courage is often seen as aggression and their fear dismissed as overreaction. The Women's Defense Coalition announced a new campaign focused on revising self-defense laws, starting with Angela's state. "No one should have to endure what Angela Carter went through," their statement read. "It's time to ensure the law protects, not punishes, those who defend themselves." Social media erupted with hashtags like Justice for Angela and Reform Self-Defense. Angela's story became a symbol of resilience and the fight for equity, inspiring people across the country to share their own experiences of bias and injustice. For Angela, the journey was far from over. While the verdict was a victory, it came at a cost. She struggled with anxiety, often replaying the events of that night and the grueling trial that followed. But Angela refused to let the experience define her solely as a victim. She began speaking at community events, sharing her story to raise awareness about the challenges faced by women of color in the justice system. "Standing up for yourself is never easy," she told an audience at a local college. "But it's even harder when the world tells you your actions aren't valid." That's why we need to change the narrative for everyone who's been doubted, dismissed, or judged unfairly. Her courage inspired others to come forward with their stories, creating a ripple effect of empowerment and advocacy. Angela also started working with local organizations to support survivors of violence, using her platform to push for systemic change. The judge's recommendation didn't go unnoticed. State legislators introduced a bill aimed at revising self-defense laws, ensuring they accounted for implicit biases and provided clearer protections for individuals defending themselves in life-threatening situations. The bill, dubbed Angela's Law by supporters, became a focal point of public debate. While some lawmakers resisted, citing concerns about the potential for misuse, others championed it as a necessary step toward justice. Over time, the case also influenced broader discussions about judicial reform. Training programs for judges and lawyers began incorporating lessons on implicit bias, with Angela's case serving as a case study. Angela's journey, though fraught with challenges, became a beacon of hope for others. Her resilience and determination to advocate for change transformed her from an everyday hero into a symbol of systemic reform. Courage isn't just about facing danger, Angela reflected during a televised interview. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it feels like the world is against you. Her words resonated deeply, echoing in courtrooms, classrooms, and community centers across the country. Months after the courtroom verdict, Angela Carter sat in her modest living room, surrounded by newspaper clippings, letters of support, and framed photographs from rallies held in her honor. Life hadn't returned to normal, but a new normal had taken shape. Angela reflected on how much her life had changed. She had gone from a private citizen to a public figure, a reluctant hero thrust into the national spotlight. While the attention had been overwhelming at times, it had also provided her with a platform to advocate for justice and equity. "I didn't set out to become a symbol," she often said. "I just wanted to protect myself. But now, I realize my story is part of something much bigger." The emotional scars from the robbery and trial remained, but Angela sought healing through action. She began attending therapy, where she processed the trauma and found strength in her journey. She also took steps to ensure her own safety, enrolling in self-defense classes and advocating for community-based safety initiatives. Angela's newfound role as an advocate brought purpose to her pain. She partnered with organizations like the Women's Defense Coalition and the Equal Justice Initiative, speaking at events, schools, and conferences about her experience. Her resilience resonated with audiences. Survivors of violence, particularly women of color, reached out to thank her for her courage. Many said her story inspired them to reclaim their voices and seek justice in their own lives. The case sparked a national conversation about race, gender, and justice. Angela's experience became a symbol of the systemic inequities that too often placed undue burdens on marginalized individuals. Angela Carter's case is a reminder that justice isn't always blind, wrote one columnist. It sees race, gender, and socioeconomic status far too clearly. Advocacy groups used Angela's story to push for legislative reforms. Angela's Law, introduced shortly after the trial, garnered widespread attention. The proposed law aimed to address the implicit biases in self-defense cases and expand protections for individuals facing life-threatening situations. While the bill faced opposition, it also gained momentum. Grassroots campaigns flooded lawmakers with petitions and letters of support. Town halls and public forums were held to discuss its potential impact. Eventually, Angela's Law was passed in her state, marking a significant step forward in the fight for equity. The case also prompted changes within the judicial system. Training programs for judges, attorneys, and law enforcement officers began including modules on implicit bias, using Angela's case as a pivotal example. Angela's community experienced a transformation as well. Her case became a rallying point for residents who had long felt ignored by the justice system. New coalitions were formed to address local issues, from police accountability to community safety initiatives. Reverend Charles Daniels, one of Angela's earliest supporters, remarked, "What started as one woman's fight for justice has become a movement." Angela reminded us that change is possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The case also inspired younger generations. Students at local schools held debates and essay contests on topics like self-defense laws, systemic bias, and the power of individual action. Angela was invited to speak at several of these events where she encouraged students to stand up for their beliefs. Change starts with awareness, she told them. But awareness isn't enough. You have to act. Angela's journey underscored a powerful truth. Courage isn't the absence of fear, but the determination to act in spite of it. Her story reminded people that ordinary individuals can challenge unjust systems and spark meaningful change. Yet, Angela was quick to emphasize that her case was just one of many. There are countless stories like mine, she said during an interview on a national talk show. The difference is mine was heard. We need to make sure everyone gets that chance. Her words resonated deeply, inspiring a wave of activism. Social media campaigns, community workshops, and fundraising efforts all worked to address the systemic issues highlighted by Angela's case. As Angela's story faded from the headlines, its impact endured. It became a reminder that the fight for justice is ongoing, a marathon, not a sprint. In her final public statement on the case, Angela left her audience with a thought-provoking question. What kind of world do we want to live in? One where justice is a privilege, or one where it's a right for everyone? Her journey had shown that change is possible, but it requires collective effort. It requires individuals to challenge biases, speak out against injustice, and demand accountability from the systems meant to protect them. Each of us has a role to play, Angela said. Mine started with a moment of fear and ended with a fight for justice. What will yours be? Though Angela's case reached its conclusion, it marked the beginning of a larger movement. Her bravery and determination became a rallying cry for those seeking a more equitable future. Angela's life was forever changed, but she found strength in her transformation. Her story became a testament to the power of resilience, advocacy, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. Justice isn't perfect, Angela reflected, but it's worth fighting for.